Hey,
Hi.
Jim. How are you?
Hi, Paul. I'm fine, thanks.
That was synchronized beautifully.
It's about as good as you're going to get around here.
Well, welcome to Washington in the summer. It's late August and kind of rainy and weird here.
Yeah, it's like November out there, the weather in terms of, but it's still like August in terms of no traffic.
Yeah, it's a neutron bomb went off. I can drive in and out without a problem, and it's a little lonely.
Right.
Half my office is gone. You could shoot a gun out there. But we're here. We're not. We should be in Martha's Vineyard or Provence somewhere. Instead, we're in Washington. That's all right.
Oh, Bob Wright has got 8x11s on us, and so we have to be here.
That's right. Yeah. So what? There's not a lot to talk about. Congress is gone. Bush is at Crawford.
The surge is working fine.
Yeah, surge is fine. There's no problems in Iraq. Nothing to talk about. So what do you want to talk about?
Well, I mean, the big news today is unique to today is Mrs. Obama, Michelle Obama,
right.
picking up where Elizabeth Edwards left off in terms of trashing the Clintons and speaking with a great deal of sort of YouTube-ready intensity and passion about how you shouldn't give in to your fears, you should look to your hopes, and so on. It was a message. Well, I mean, you're probably closer to the Democrats and the Democratic primary electorate than I am, but I was quite struck by kind of how sort of frankly compelling she was. Who knows what will happen to Obama's candidacy, but I know she's got a great future as a TV figure.
I have not seen the broadcast, but that's what I hear. And it's the same broadcast we're talking about, where she said that if you can't keep your family together, you can't keep it together in the White House, something like that.
There's a long speech in Iowa, and I'm not 100% sure that there might be two different versions floating around out there. This is again what bloggers are for, is to sort out this. But yeah, she definitely said that. I'm not sure that it's in the same context of the speech that I saw on YouTube, but nonetheless. She is intense, and she is getting kind of personal, and once again, the Clintons find themselves, under fire from fellow Democrats, which I guess is the price you pay for being a front runner.
Well, it's the price you pay for being the Clintons. I think Bill Clinton's been under fire from fellow Democrats since he ran for president in 1992. The one thing that I did read, I think it was on Josh Marshall's site, is that the line that I just said about how if you can't keep your family together, you can't keep it together in the White House, and I probably am misquoting it, was, and the Obama campaign has reiterated, that was about the Obama campaign, not about the Clinton campaign, and the Chicago Sun-Times sort of said, well, it could be interpreted as being about the Clinton family, but if you actually read it in context, it was really hard to take that away from it. She was saying, it was in the context of what she and her husband do in order to have to be there for their kids while he's running.
Right,
and
right.
It was in that sense, it seemed completely innocent, but one could lift it out of its context and put it out there, and then it looks like it's an attack. So I'd be interested to see if the Clinton administration, if the Hillary folks decide that it is an attack and bring out the nuclear weapons or not.
See, Paul, right now it's the Clinton juggernaut. If things go as they plan, it'll be the Clinton administration.
Right.
But not merely now, it's the Clinton machine.
Yeah.
You're right. Whether the Clinton people choose to react or not, but you have to say that Michelle Obama is in her 40s. I mean, she's been married to him for quite some time and had plenty of time to realize that you get into the political arena like this and you say things like that, people are going to take it as a dig at your major rival, especially when I think the Obama campaign is starting to dawn on them that they can run a respectable, admirable, aspirational second place campaign all the way to second place, and that's not what they have in mind.
Yeah, well, if I were on the Hillary side, I would take it as an attack and respond accordingly, whether it was intended to or not, and reinforce the meme that they're not quite ready for prime time or whatever. I mean, there's all kinds of things you do to that.
Or on the other hand, you might say, "Geez, Obama has a point." I mean, you don't expect the Clintons to agree with that, but people out there might be saying,
Sure.
yeah,
I mean,
do we really want to go through all that again?
That is the great unanswered question about Hillary's campaign, is whether people look at it and say, hey, we get Bill back, or they say, oh, we get Bill back. I mean, no one knows the answer to that one.
All right, well, that's enough on her.
Right.
Okay, and I guess we kind of did Hillary, too, there.
We did do Hillary, so
Okay.
what else?
Let's do Karl Rove.
Karl Rove.
You first.
Gosh. Everything about Karl Rove that could possibly be said, I think, has been said. I can't think of too much more to say. He aimed to have a realignment and failed. I think that was the message of Josh Green's big piece in the Atlantic. I thought was quite good, and I agreed with it. And
that was a good piece in the Atlantic. My favorite anecdote from that piece, just revealing something about the spirit of the Bush administration, was told by, of all people, Dick Armey, their fellow Texan, that is to Rove and Bush,
right, I remember
the former House Majority Leader, who said that when he was, with Bill Clinton, and Armey, of course, voted to impeach Clinton,
right.
and Clinton said that, look, Dick Armey is my least favorite member of Congress out of all 535 of them plus change. So for having said all that, Armey sort of got in the habit of taking his little visitor's badge, a little temporary pass thing, and sort of handing it to President Clinton and saying, look, I want to sign this just for fun, and I'll give it to the first school kid that I see out there on the street, like it's a little souvenir, and so the kid will get the president's autograph that way. And Clinton said, sure, why not? And so that happened all through the Clinton administration. And then the Army, this is him telling the tale to Josh Green, tried to do that with Bush. And Bush and Rove said no. And they said, oh, you'll just put it on eBay, which is sort of maybe true, by the way, but it's still kind of insulting to explain it that way. And then without thinking to themselves, look, we're saying no to Armey, who's the number 2 person in the House leadership. We're saying no to him, but we have to then be smart enough to give him something else. We have to say, listen, we can't sign this thing because the White House lawyers won't let us do it, but we will do something else for you that sort of makes you feel good and leaves us as a win-win. And they just said, no, buzz off.
Yeah.
And obviously, Armey retired, I think, in 2002. So 5 or 6 years later, Armey is still nursing that grudge, which gave Josh one of, I thought, his better and more revealing anecdotes that, in spite of all the strategy and vision and ambition and grandeur that Rove saw himself as, they were nonetheless kind of petty and narrow when it really came right down to it.
Yeah, and with their own side too. Although I got to say that the one aspect of that story that I didn't think quite was right. I mean, maybe I'm not doing it justice, but it seemed to me there was an undercurrent of, well, if he had better relations with Congress, things would have worked out better for them. It seems like the whole time that he was stiff-arming and dissing members of Congress, they were voting for the White House 98% of the time. They got almost everything they wanted until really very recently. So I'm not sure that they were wrong in thinking that they could ignore and diss their own party in Congress and get away with it. They certainly did.
Could, and you're right about there's some congressional support, but now all they have is the acts of every Republican member of Congress in their backs.
Right.
So in other words, if you can win, everybody hates you, and then everybody's got the rest of their lives and the rest of their careers to get revenge after you're no longer powerful.
Yeah, well, that is the case, and pettiness in that regard just doesn't, in the end, pay off. So I'll never understand it. But so we're done with Karl Rove. Is there any?
The only thing I'd say about listen, if Karl Rove had quit right after the 2004 election,
right,
he would have made $10 million as a lobbyist and speaker and whatever else in 2005 alone. And they would have said, oh my gosh, the White House Social Security plan failed and Katrina was a disaster, only because Rove wasn't here to guide us, because he's a great genius.
Right.
And he would have been 1,000,000 times more powerful inside the White House, let alone out there in the country.
Right. And they would have been bringing him back in now to help save the floundering presidency.
Exactly. They say, we have to beg to get Rove to come back from Davos or somewhere, Beijing, to come back and walk us through the fine points of hurricane reliefs and
Right.
and Social Security and the Iraq surge and whatever else. Instead, he let himself just be underfoot, and as we all know in this town, as with human nature, familiarity breeds contempt. He was just one more guy, one more bump on the log when things went wrong, and they blamed him too.
Well, yes, although he was the architect of the things going wrong, at least on the domestic side. So, he did, so think about it. Had Karl Rove chosen, right, one of the great, I think, mistakes of the Clinton years was going for health care reform before they did welfare reform.
Right.
And, I mean, there are people who disagree, but I think, in general, that's conceded as a huge strategic error. Had Rove, at Bush's moment of maximum power, either after 9/11 or after the 2004 re-election, said, now is our moment to push immigration reform, and we'll worry about Social Security later, I think they wouldn't be in quite the same jam they're in. They probably would have gotten it passed. It's just before everything fell through, when he really did have some wind at his back, and I think the conservatives were not as willing to strike out on their own, so the whole talk radio thing about illegal immigrants hadn't quite started yet. In fact, hadn't started at all. I think he could have had a big success and succeeded at that one piece of Rove's overall plan to realign the country, which was to reach out to Hispanics and bring them in, at least enough of them away from the Democrats that the Republicans could win in the far west and so forth, so the Mountain West. So it was a huge strategic error, and it was totally Karl Rove's.
Okay, that's that's enough on him.
Yes, I know I'm done. What else?
Huckabee. Let's talk about the Republican race for a second.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I think I was struck by two things about the Iowa straw poll back in Ames on the 11th. One was that Republican turnout was down 40%
right.
from 8 years ago, and two was that Mitt Romney spent, according to some estimates, as much as $4 million.
Right, but $400 a vote, or what was it?
Some astonishing number, and polled, and did win it, and you got to give him that. But I think we got 31 or 32% of the
That's
vote.
right.
And Huckabee, who spent almost nothing, because he has almost nothing, got 18% of the vote. I actually, wrote a column about Huckabee, in which I said, look, he's not as rich and handsome as Romney, and he's not as tortured and heroic as McCain, and he's not as sort of operatic and intense as Giuliani, but he does seem like kind of a nice guy, and kind of a good guy, and has clearly thought about domestic issues in a way that we kind of need. I mean, for example, I thought he made a really good point about Homeland Security and FEMA, as we're all thinking about Hurricane Dean and Hurricane whatever coming next. He said, look, the mission of the Homeland Security Department and the mission of FEMA are fundamentally different. Homeland Security is about prevention and detection and potential crime scene and so on and so on. And FEMA is about emergency relief. And they're just different missions with different outlooks and different people and so on and so on. And he said, of course they should be separate. And then he went on, and somewhat surprising for a guy running inside the Republican primary, to praise James Lee Witt, the Clinton FEMA director, who he said was very effective at what he did. And of course, back then in the Clinton years, FEMA was a cabinet-level department, which is to say it had real swag, at least relatively, inside the federal government, compared to now, where FEMA is just another peg in the bureaucratic hierarchy.
Yeah, and speaking of FEMA and Huckabee, I heard him months ago. I think it was on C-SPAN, some kind of an event. And he was asked about the refugees from New Orleans, and he was able, I can't tell you the words that he used, but it was just a wonderful welcoming of the folks from New Orleans.
I think I remember that too. I think what he said was, I said to my cabinet officials that when you see some woman getting off an airplane or from a bus with, like her bathrobe, but all disheveled and messed up from the travel and the wreckage of what she'd just been through, I want you to think that that's your own mother.
Yeah, it was along those lines. And I thought, that is just fabulous. And I thought, this guy seems to have the potential to reach any American who's got a heart. And I was surprised that he had not done as well, and was kind of excited that he did better in the Iowa straw poll.
I think what he has going for him is he's got a kind of obviously a sort of a Christian brotherhood sensibility. Plus, he's got some bureaucratic smarts about how to actually do things.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good combination if you could ever, get near something important.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we shall see. We shall see. But did you see any of the fireworks from the most recent Democratic debates?
Is this the one with Stephanopoulos?
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one.
Let's see, what was the fireworks in that one? You tell me. I can't remember.
Well, yeah.
How many debates have there been now?
27, I think. No, I don't know. A lot.
227.
And I've seen bits of all of them. I don't think I've seen any of them all the way through.
So what blew up in your face?
Oh gosh, I'm just I'm looking for something for us to talk about. Nothing comes to mind. I did see some of it, and it was anyway.
Okay, I think what but all I can remember is somebody saying, talking about you used the word meme a while back, is that Biden and Dodd and all these sort of third tier players in the Democratic hierarchy race are going after Obama. I think they figure Hillary's too much to pump off right now, but if they can get rid of Obama, they at least have a chance to get in the ring with her.
Right.
And that's what they're looking for. So, again, in the game of micro-strategy. But obviously, none of these debates are really holding our attention. They're not really saying anything. They all kind of blur together. The last one the gay one was a while back, and they all they're just a blur.
Right.
What can you say?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, Obama had a great line he prepared in that debate in which he said, "Well, I prepared for this debate by riding the bumper cars at the state fair." Very, very charming.
And if that's not good enough to get him elected president, what
Absolutely.
is?
I guess my one thought about this, the overall thought about these debates is that we have known for a long time that Hillary Clinton is not the greatest giver of prepared speeches in front of large audiences that's ever. She doesn't have the natural inclination or talent or both to deliver a stem winder of a speech that gets people terribly excited. What she is extremely good at, and sort of better than anyone you can think of, is answering questions. Right? We'll go back to 1993 and her performance in front of Congress when she was defending the Clinton health care plan, or at least talking about the Clinton health care plan, and before that plan collapsed, kind of the universal acclaim she got for sitting there for 4 hours, taking all kinds of questions and being able, without notes, to answer them with precision and a kind of even keel. What we've had in the primary so far are really a series of events where she got to answer questions, either. And she's done a lot of these sort of town hall meeting type things where she stands with a microphone and takes questions from the audience, or primarily, and that's how most primary voters have seen her, in these debates. And she has done extremely well, I think probably better than any other candidate in these debates. And
I agree with that. I think that's a good point. As a speaker, as an orator, she really only has one tone, that kind of screech, 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 loud, one level of voice that I won't torture our listeners by trying to imitate.
It's below a screech. It's a kind of monotone.
Yeah, it's a monotone.
6.5, 7 on the scale there.
Thank you. Right, you could add precision to what I was trying to say, but she has no. And the rare occasions when she does try to change things, she develops a fake Southern accent, which is so obviously fake that it turns people off. Whereas in conversation and answering a question, you can get away with that kind of monotone. And you seem level-headed and sort of poised and assured and all that good stuff. I mean, it reminds me, now that you say that, I hadn't really thought about that. It's other politicians who are not such good orators, but were smart, did well in the same venue. And two that come to mind are Richard Nixon, who Roger Ailes in 1968 had dreamed up this man in the arena format, which they put on TV, where people just asked Nixon a question, candidate Nixon, and Nixon would give a good answer and got himself elected president. Yeah. Somebody else who was sort of the same thing was George H.W. Bush, the Bush 41, who Roger Ailes also counseled and said, look, again, you're not a great speaker, but you are a pretty good answerer and you know your stuff, so why not just skip the bombast and the oratory and just go right to answering people's questions. There's two examples where the person who followed that model got elected president. I'm sure Roger Ailes will be amused to note that maybe Hillary will be doing the same thing.
Well, I think there's no question that
every 20 years
her staff understands this, and I don't know if they knew. They're probably smart enough to know in advance. Look, we got all these debates. This is going to she's really going to shine. But she certainly has, and we'll see how long it lasts. But she's doing very well, and deservedly so at this point.
She is. She's running far and away the best campaign on either side of the aisle, I think.
Absolutely.
But now we can get to something really interesting. Instead of the usual hack stuff, we should talk about the Washington Monthly's cover story, which I'm filled with admiration over.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Hope it shows up in the camera there.
Yes, right there. It's right over my right shoulder. So we're a small magazine. We take every chance we can to promote. So.
Well, anyway, it's a heck of an argument, and Paul, why don't you tell us what it is?
Well, this is the third year in a row we've done a college guide, and it's very consciously aimed at being an alternative to the U.S. News College Guide, which, as you know, in recent weeks has really been taking a pummeling. We were among the first to give it a whack, but now a lot of other people have piled on. 61 college presidents from liberal arts schools have announced they're going to refuse to cooperate with U.S. News in next year's guide, and their argument is, and it's a good argument, that the U.S. News doesn't measure what it says it measures. It says it's about. It says it tries to rank colleges based on their academic excellence, when what they really measure are things like the prestige and selectivity and what percentage of alumni give. These are all kind of interesting numbers, but they tell you almost nothing about what goes on in the classroom, which can be the only real measure of academic excellence. And so we decided to look at colleges from a completely different vantage point, rather than these guides like U.S. News that purport to tell you which is a good school for you to improve your future, like what can college do for me. We ask, what do colleges do for the country? And so we measure colleges based on three criteria: social mobility, research, and service. And by social mobility, we mean the degree to which colleges recruit and graduate students from low-income families, the number of PhDs and the amount of research they crank out, and then on service, whether they encourage their students to go into ROTC, Peace Corps, and other community service routes. And
I must say right there, I'll just interrupt for a moment to say that, a magazine commonly thought of as liberal, of course, would put the Peace Corps as a desiderata, but to put an ROTC as another way of measuring your service to the country, I thought, to coin a phrase, it was kind of fair and balanced.
Well, thank you.
To do it that way. I admired that enormously.
Well, thank you. We do get a lot of trouble from some of our liberal friends for doing that. I'm sorry we do, but it's nevertheless what you simply can't look at ROTC as being anything other than one of the routes that college students can take to serve their country. And we bemoan the fact that some Ivy League schools most Ivy League schools keep ROTC off the campus. And in fact, MIT often comes out way ahead of Harvard and some of the other schools on our measures, because they take all the spillover of ROTC that Harvard will take. And so the whole idea is to create a measure that allows schools to have bragging rights on things they darn well ought to have bragging rights on. And so if a school front loads a bunch of kids into ROTC, and another school is ticked off about it, well, they'll have to front load kids into ROTC or the Peace Corps or something,
or risk the wrath of the Washington Monthly.
That's right, and our massive readership.
But tell me who won the ranking then.
The number one school in this year's Washington Monthly College rankings is Texas A&M, the Aggies, and they won it through high numbers of ROTC and high numbers of engineering graduates and research. They won hands down. Actually, they didn't win hands down. That right on their tail, because you could say, well, Texas A&M, that means it's the conservative values of Texas A&M that won it. Actually, close on their heels are two of the most liberal schools out there, UCLA and UC Berkeley, which won also for PhDs and for having a lot of their kids who do use their work study for community service. So there's no right or wrong way to there's no ideology here to the Washington Monthly, but the point is, none of these schools are in the top 20 of the U.S. News rankings. In fact, I think Texas A&M is 60th or something in the U.S. News rankings. Curiously enough, a lot of the top schools in U.S. News don't do as well on our rankings. I think was it Princeton is number 1 in the U.S. News this year?
I think so, yeah.
And they're number 28th on ours.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, what struck me about this, in your little letter, editor's letter at the beginning, you said, why don't we ask every now and then what somebody can, in this case a college or university, can do for the public good, for the common good. I think that's, I mean, it's sort of amazing that a question that's so obviously animated the people who founded most of the universities and colleges in this country. They didn't do it so they could get ahead. They'd already gotten ahead. They were already, rich or a minister or a politician or something like that. They were just doing something that they thought would be good for the country in the future, for future generations.
Absolutely.
That spirit, which animated higher education to begin with, in substantial measure, has gotten kind of so lost that in fact the U.S. news ratings, which not only are they controversial in terms of sort of yuppie scummery, in terms of just like what can I do for myself to get ahead and get into the best law school, but also have been infinitely criticized for the way to beat that the system can get gamed, by universities and so on and so on. But just to go back to the basic question of, why are we doing this at all?
That's right.
I thought that was just something I won't say I never thought of, but I certainly never thought of in this context until your issue. Of course, that's what we should be measuring. Now, it's not to say that you still can't be a yuppie scum and go to the school that you think will get you the best MBA.
Right.
But the rest of us, including the people who are dishing out the tax exemptions and so on and so on, have a right to have a say-so in how these things are judged. And I mean, I'm not a graduate of any of the schools that you've mentioned, whether it's Texas A&M or UCLA or UC Berkeley or Princeton. But I've been to Texas A&M, and I will say it's a hell of a school in terms of spirit, community, intensity, loyalty. The legendary Aggie muster.
Mm-hmm.
You read about that, and in the middle of Iwo Jima, they would say, well, it's Aggie Day, whatever that was. So they have to have a little muster, and they'd all come around and sing a little school song and so on. It's kind of in some way it's kind of silly, and the other hand it's kind of sweet, and it's certainly meaningful to anyone who attends such a school.
Well, it's funny. One of the commenters on our blog, our website, that was commenting on Kevin Drum's posting on this was military. I think he was an officer, active duty, I believe, and he was saying that he went to a different school in Texas, and he said you can't deny the kind of esprit de corps that Texas A&M produces. So he wasn't surprised that they'd done so well. That's the point you make is I think the right one. It's not that we think that there's no use in a measure of colleges of sort of academic excellence or how to get ahead. I mean, that obviously is what most people individually go to college for, and we have no problem with guides that sort of would fairly measure which schools are actually give a great education, and we would include those in our measures too if we could get the data. I don't think the data is gettable right now, and that's why U.S. News has to resort to such oddball heuristics. But it's one thing to say, I want good data on where I'm about to spend tens of thousands of dollars of tuition money that could change my life, and that's a good thing to do. But you and I are putting a lot of our tax dollars at work here. We ought to have a shot at knowing what universities are doing with our tax dollars. Either it's student aid or research grants or just various kinds of tax breaks. Universities are heavily subsidized and very, very lightly regulated, and in terms of the very least telling us how they're doing on these measures.
Which then takes you to another article, which I actually do have a bone to pick with, and that's the article on 1 DuPont Circles. Talk about that for a second. Yeah,
this is a story by Ben Adler from the Center for American Progress, and he does a profile of this building. It's called 1 DuPont Circle. It's a building in a trendy neighborhood near downtown Chicago, where
D.C.
in D.C. rather, where a lot of the top higher ed lobbying organizations have their headquarters, and we called it the building where good education reform ideas go to die. This is a very powerful but little discussed lobbying force. Everything from the college, national, state level flagship universities to the organization, the Association of Bursars or whatever, and there's dozens of these groups, and they work very much in concert to protect the interests of universities and colleges. And what Ben argues, I think, very effectively, is that time and again, though sometimes they work for for righteous causes, time and again they've stopped efforts to get colleges to do the right thing, such as, for instance, giving us information on whether how well the students are doing, how good the education is in the classrooms.
Right. I think that was a good point. I think all these issues concerning accountability and transparency are valuable. And my parents were academics at sort of no-name commuter colleges in Chicago and thereabouts, and so I have some familiarity with academic politics and the way they spend money and the way they allocate resources and so on. And it definitely could use a little, Peter Drucker to get in there and make things better. The mere fact that it's now routine for tuition to be, $35,000 or $40,000 per year does strike a little high and kind of gets in the way.
My daughter is headed off to college at the end of the week, and we just paid the tuition bill, and it's unbelievable.
Right. So there's something has kind of gone wrong with the system where they can just simply jack up tuition 10% every year like that. The concern I had about the article was, the Washington Monthly is at its best when it is advancing a vaguely virtue-based sense of judgment and on an egalitarian metric that says, look, what are we doing to make this, back to the spirit of Charlie Peters,
right,
to make this country a better place, and are we all doing our part, or at least are we asking ourselves, are we all doing our part?
Right.
Even if we choose not to, we should at least be aware of the question. The concern I had about that article was trying to use the power of the state to crush, for example, legacy admissions, which to me, and I speak as a non-legacy admission myself, it strikes me that it's valuable, back to the argument why Texas A&M is a good school, to have a kind of a lineage and a tradition and the ability for a school to pick its own students and not be overly worried about the feds coming in to crush them. I do think there's a lot to be said for sort of the Edmund Burke idea of little platoons, where we try different things. It's not so much that we all have to be virtuous and we all have to do what the government wants us to. We can all be judged. We can all be transparent. We can all be seen by. But I think we should have the right to keep our own idiosyncratic traditions from locality to locality.
Well, do you have the right to keep your idiosyncratic traditions and get paid by the federal government? Because I think it's legitimate to say that if a college wants to choose the son or daughter, the dim son or daughter of an alum over the clever son or daughter who isn't that well connected, that's their right. But the problem is that they're also taking millions of dollars in federal aid at the same time. And federal aid, do we as a country want to endorse that? And, the whole idea of the meritocracy on which the university system is supposed to be built, and conservatives have been relentless in making this point when it comes to race, is that the best man or woman wins. And what the policy that you're discussing that the universities stopped was one by Ted Kennedy, in which he said, look, if you do legacy admissions and also early admissions, which is another way that the system is gamed to advantage the already advantaged. If you do that and you don't do a better job of recruiting minorities and poor kids, then we're going to take away some federal money. And it was on that basis. They wanted to have their federal money and be able to discriminate in favor of legacies. And I'm not sure Even, I'm not sure how you argue for that.
Well, I think the answer is that a federal government powerful enough to get in the interstices of every last college admissions decision is a pretty powerful federal government. I'm much more comfortable in terms of just my own sense of pluralism and sort of distributed power in saying, look, we're going to throw money in lots of different places, but we're going to judge, we're going to measure it. And then after maybe 10 or 20 or 100 years, we'll say, clearly something has gone wrong in our system here. But what bothers me is that it's, one could easily see the Teddy Kennedy plan for crippling legacy admissions and early admissions as a way to have a federal inspector inside the room at every college admissions committee. As my old boss, Ronald Reagan, said, a federal government strong enough to give you everything you want in terms of social justice and equality and everything else is also strong enough to take it all away.
Right.
And that's my fear. I mean, believe me, that is a concern I have, and it's for all the reasons you said. I mean, we all sort of agree that if you're getting a tax exemption or a tax deduction, you're getting a gift from the government. You're getting something. You're getting a license, as it were, a writ. And there should be some sense of responsibility that you have in return for that. And it's not just to, anybody who's walked around a college campus these days and sees, another, $500 million building with somebody's name in giant letters emblazoned on it, may conclude that there's more going on here than, advancing education. Right. There's Nelson Rockefellerism, run amok. And we should be careful about saddling ourselves with that sort of white elephant physical plant in a lot of places. So there are lots of issues here. And again, I think that the Washington Monthly is to be admired for raising these issues, as they have for a long time. That was my one concern about that particular article. But I certainly call everybody's attention to realizing this is the argument made by the public choice economists, Buchanan and Tulloch, for which they won the Nobel Prize, 30 years ago, is that here in Washington, people who lobby for the public sector and people who behave in the public sector have a set of incentives and behavior patterns that aren't a whole lot different than people in the private sector. They want to get bigger offices, they want pay raises, they want bigger budgets, they want bigger empires, and we need to judge them and their actions with the same hard-nosed metric that we apply to, Citigroup and Goldman Sachs. Otherwise, we will have this place where, the corporations are scrutinized, as they should be, and we simply say, oh, but Harvard, who can criticize Harvard? Right. I mean, we all know that they're here to help us.
Right. Well, it's interesting, the argument of light federal regulation and the argument that free reign for institutions to behave idiosyncratically and do as they want is precisely the argument that has won out and been deployed by the higher ed lobby. And they've been successful for years with that argument. And we think of higher ed as one of the essential liberal bastions. And in this case, they've been deploying a Buchananite, Reagan-esque, Hayek type argument. And look, I'm not one to want the heavy jackboot of the federal government and everything either. But at some point, it becomes a little ridiculous when, especially in the case of higher ed, when not only is there this federal largesse, but there as you pointed out in the beginning, we have an expectation of higher education as being something other than profit-maximizing, self-interested organizations. These are the institutions that are in loco parentis for our kids. These are the institutions that will determine in many ways whether we can be economically competitive with other nations or not, whether we have the manpower to fight wars or solve puzzles of disease and so forth. Think of almost any problem we have, from the flat wages to the lack of Arabic speakers in the federal government, and the answers come back to harnessing the power of our universities and colleges. So, at least part of the answer. So, there's just a compelling public need, in my opinion, to have democratic government scrutinize the practices of higher education. And look, I'm in favor of as little government as possible to get the job done. But I am in favor of getting the job done. And I think you and I are probably in agreement on at least one aspect of this, and that is universities ought to come clean with the information.
I agree. I agree completely. You want small d democratic government with small r Republican features, which is to say certain sort of rights and prerogatives that are woven into the system to begin with that keep the government in check. That's a checks and balances, a pluralism approach, which I think is vital. But I certainly agree that whoever's running the government these days, and I realize in terms of the presidency as Bush, has failed on things like do we have Arab language speakers and Farsi language speakers and Dari language speakers in places where we need them in the Middle East? Do we have the military equipment to win the war? I mean, why has it taken 5 years to get an adequate vehicle that can withstand an IED? Where's been the technological evolution that we needed, that we saw during World War II?
Right. Absolutely.
When we went from cavalry to the A-bomb in 4 years. Right. Where's the equivalent nowadays? It's kind of astonishing that, as I hear myself say this, I recall back to, President Roosevelt calling in, the president of Harvard, President Conant, and saying, listen, okay, what are we going to do about this? And they created all these institutions of, this was a different university setup and a different, for that matter, different America. And maybe it was a better America when it came to actually winning a war. And I'm not a fan of the Iraq War at all, but I'm sort of also struck by the signal that we're sending to the rest of the world that if we can get beat by Iraqi insurgents, weakness does invite further threats.
Well, there's no question that you have right now a picture of the American government, unable to just do the basics, unable to keep their bridges from falling down or rescue people, from the roofs in New Orleans or provide...
Or from mines in Utah.
Yeah, or from mines in Utah. Oh, my God, don't get me started. That's just a horrible situation, and it is almost one-to-one. We wrote a piece published a piece a couple of years ago about the decline of mine safety, and what I want to make the point here that the Bush administration puts out numbers about how mine safety deaths have actually gone down. Again, one has to take anything the Bush administration says with a grain of salt. They have gone down, but so have the number of miners. And if you actually measure it correctly, which is the number of miners doing deep mining, right? Most of mining has shifted to surface mining, which is not nearly as dangerous as the underground mining that's dangerous. The numbers have been going up for quite some time. So these are just more examples of this sort of idea that we shouldn't have a muscular federal government. The whole idea of defanging FEMA. Remember Joe Albaugh? He's got a great quote where he said that under the Clinton administration, FEMA had been too forward-leaning, and it was undermining the incentive of states and localities to take care of themselves. So we're going to kind of back off a little bit and let you all,
let Governor Blanco and Mayor Nagin handle it.
Right. I mean, it was just an attitude toward the federal government of fear of its power. And look, I understand that, but if you just can't be a superpower without a competent, strong federal government. And my great hope is that the next campaign, that the issue of competent, strong federal government will go from being a kind of subtext to being the actual issue. You've got people on both sides who can make the argument that they can deliver that. Mitt Romney was certainly a competent manager in some realms of his life. In at least the first term of his administration, Rudy Giuliani was too. Hillary's had this experience in the White House and can lay claim to that. Richardson,
absolutely,
Bill Richardson, and our friend Mike Huckabee. So So I'm really hoping that becomes kind of the great issue.
I agree. It would be fun. What was the issue there? I hope you put the link up on Blogging Heads about the mine safety articles, because I didn't see that.
I think the gentleman, he was the environmental reporter for the Charleston, West Virginia Gazette, and he was a Alicia Patterson fellow, and it was a wonderful piece.
Because you do think that whatever money they saved in terms of management, mine safety, especially in the mine, and I guess it's the Crandall mine in Utah, they've spent 1 million times that now on helicopters and drills and emergency workers. Not to mention the 3 additional lives that have been lost trying to rescue the first 6. And so, I mean, it does. You get the worst of all possible worlds, which is you get a careless system to begin with, and then you actually spend more money. It's like a Superfund site. You're digging up the damage than you did if you do it right the first. As your grandmother and my grandmother both told us.
Do it right the first time. And the great tragedy is we were moving to a system where we really were reducing mine deaths, every year, and there was just a resistance there among the people that staffed the Bush administration to continuing that. And I hope whichever party comes back to power will give up the ghost on that and just sort of begin to live with the fact that we need competent, strong regulatory mechanisms in this country to, if you're going to have coal mining, you better make sure. I mean, how has this hurt I'm not a great fan of coal mining, but if one were, how has this hurt the cause of coal mining?
I agree. I mean, we're in a strange situation where, on the one hand, we need more energy than ever in terms of, and all the projections show that, and so on and so on. Obviously, the global warmers, have a different view of all this. One wonders whether one could have a system whereby we're mining lots of coal through whatever safe mechanism we can come up with, and then also inventing some clean way of processing it, burying the CO2 under the ground or something like that. I mean, something tells me that when the smoke, no pun intended, clears on the current energy environment conundrum, the answer is going to be revealed to be lots more clean energy, however it's cleaned, as opposed to a radical fall in energy consumption. Because not only is that true for America, but I guarantee it's true for China and India.
I couldn't agree more. One just has to understand that we will be consuming vastly more energy in the future than we are today, and nothing can or should stop that, really, in my opinion, or else you consign billions else on the planet to a meager life. But so the answer must be energy that is non-toxic to the environment. And where are you going to get that? I'm not an expert on this, but I don't think coal is the answer. Coal just happens to be what's lying under our feet everywhere, biomass or nuclear or whatever. But again, I would get back to your point about government. Jamie Galbraith had a book review about a couple of books in an issue or two ago. One of them was Bill McKibben's book on his most recent book. And Jamie's point is that people like Bill McKibben who talk about sort of the need to kind of begin to live in a local environment and be self-sustaining and so forth. All of these things are going to require a level of competence. To cope with global warming is going to require a level of competence that the federal government simply does not show right now. There's just no shortcut, if we're going to cope with this thing, to having a government that works better than it's been working. And I personally think you saw the seeds of this renaissance in the Clinton years, where you had FEMA go from a kind of backwater, inept graveyard place you put third-tier political appointees. Remember Hurricane Andrew in Florida in 1992, to being, as Mike Huckabee said, quite a successful and competent agency under James Lee Witt, to being, within a couple of years, a disaster again. So agencies can be poorly managed or well managed. Another example would be the VA, which 10, 15 years ago was the butt of jokes. It was socialized medicine gone awry. It was Dickensian and horrible. Now it's by almost every conceivable measure, it's the best quality health care in America. We've written about this before. So
I know that piece by Phil Longman, who's at the New America Foundation here, was quite a piece, and another eye-opener. What do you think about Hillary's plan for the proposal for a public service academy?
I like it. I know that group, and I wish them well, and I think it's a great idea. You know, 100 more like it. I don't think in and of itself it's going to make a world of difference, but it suggests that Hillary gets it, that she understands that just as we'll never turn around underperforming schools without getting better teachers, so we'll never turn around the federal government without getting better government employees. I mean, every CEO you ever talk to will tell you it's a people business, that the key to his success is talent. And the key to the federal government is talent, too. And who you appoint and who the appointees appoint and so forth can mean a world of difference. It's really very basic.
I agree, but there are other issues as well. You know, I was in Paris a few years back, and showing what a nerd I am, I went to the French Postal Museum, you know, historical museum, right there in Paris, just, you know, and was struck by the quality of the uniforms that a French postman had, you know, 200 years ago. They were fancy. They had big sort of bronze breastplates on them and so on and so on. They were quite something. And I thought, well, that would be the way to get some esprit back in the mail service. Give them uniforms. And then I think to my own experience in the federal government, watching you know, the Army and the Public Health Service and NOAA, you know, the National Oceanographic and whatever it is, atmospheric agency, has its own little navy, complete with uniforms. And I thought, well, gee, with these people actually seem to be kind of better because they've got the Weberian insignia of rank and status. And so I'm wondering whether in that Hillary Clinton public service thing, if they really are serious about making it a West Point of public service, of like civilian service, whether or not it would be wise to go back to the old model of having
uniforms.
Exactly.
Well, you know, it's interesting that if you look at sort of a couple of semi-private sector equivalents, Teach for America, for instance, or City Year, the success of those organizations, and we wrote about them last year in our college guide, at least a big part of the success is convincing sort of extremely ambitious and capable young people who might not necessarily have the strongest drive for public service, but at least some, that this is a route to respect and something you want to put on your resume. And so you now have a situation where on some of the top, most select college campuses, select in the U.S. News sense, not the Washington Monthly sense, that you know, a quarter of the class of some of these Ivy League schools is applying for City Year or applying for Teach for America, and so you get this flood of amazing talent into teaching, into the public sector. And if in addition to giving them an esprit de corps uniform, if they can make it really cool on college campuses to you know, apply for the chance to get into the Public Service Academy. It could be, I don't speak French, so I probably mispronounce it, but whatever the great French Parisian school.
Oh, ENARC, the École Nationale, whatever it is. Yeah.
Like every prime minister has been through there or whatever.
Right.
So
right.
Maybe we could borrow from the French.
Well, I mean, as I remind people, there's been an identifiable France for a couple thousand years, so they must know something.
Yeah.
In spite of themselves, about how to keep a country together and how to, you know, maintain national unity and so on. So, I mean, America ought not to look too much askance at civilizations like France or China or Japan that have been around for a long time and flourished. They might know something that we don't about how to keep yourself together.
Well, Jim, you know, maybe as a way to begin wrapping up, I want to ask you a question, and that is, I have looked in vain for a conservatism, for the right kind of big government conservatism. By that I mean what we've been talking about, a conservatism that very much values a strong, competent federal government, you know, obviously outside the realm of national of the military, where conservatives, historically approve of big government, a conservatism that says that big government is part of national strength, part of greatness. I mean, you hear David Brooks kind of talk about this, or Ross Douthat, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. But they seem to be, talking about 6 of those guys in the entire Republican Party, and everyone else, it seems to me, it has drunk the Kool-Aid of small government, and all the candidates are talking about small government. And at what point do you think we could have a real competition in this country between 2 parties trying to outdo each other in making government work?
Well, I'm not exactly sure. I will say that a lot of the national greatness conservatives quickly got rid of that guys and became neocons as soon as they had the chance, and they chose to define national greatness as remaking the Middle East, as opposed to remaking,
the federal government,
or
America.
4 parts of the country, or so on and so on. So. The notion of a domestic-minded, modest conservatism aimed at, promoting the general welfare, to coin a phrase, or ensuring the domestic tranquility, to coin another phrase, or providing for the common defense, that has been kind of lost. I think that, much of it is that the libertarians have sort of taken over, frankly, not only the Republican Party, but also the Democratic Party at its higher reaches. The Democrats will sit still for a long discussion about, the need for national health insurance and the need to, public service and so on and so on. And then you find what they really want to talk about is legalizing gay marriage and keeping the border open, and maybe a little something on legalizing marijuana. In other words, I think that the libertarian view that if you have enough money, you'll be fine no matter what the political system is, no matter how dysfunctional it is, and what you really want is somebody to protect your right to be yourself and be free and fulfill all your fantasies and destinies. That spirit, I think, controls the Democratic Party as much as the Republican Party. And so, of course, something as boring as mine safety or border control or, keeping kids from getting shot in Newark is small potatoes and a low priority. When I see the top Democrats all competing to defend, open borders and promote and many of them endorsing a guest worker program, I think to myself, gee, these people are much more interested in making sure that the people of Washington, D.C. have nannies than they are in making sure that some blue-collar worker in Anderson, Indiana can keep his job.
Well, I think there's a couple of things working in there. I guess I would disagree with you in the sense that it does seem to me that there is a consistent Democratic focus. I wouldn't say consistent. There's a intermittent but powerful Democratic focus on improving the capacity of government to solve problems. Not every Democrat gets behind it, and some are more interested in identity politics than that. But again, just to go back to the Clinton administration, you have quite a few examples, not nearly enough, of real agency turnaround, of a real focus. Al Gore's whole reinventing government thing, which was a kind of a pretty consistent theme throughout the Clinton years, and done not with creating vast new bureaucracies, but actually fewer federal workers than they started with. And you're beginning to see a little bit of that in the Democratic field. I don't see any of it on the Republican side. So
I think Huckabee and Romney both talk this language.
Yeah.
Look, the point here is not that the Democrats do nothing, just like the Republicans don't do nothing on this. The point is, what are I think the paramount value in the Republican Party, certainly in the nomination process, is who's going to hold down the size of the federal government and cut taxes.
Right.
I think that the paramount value, and the one area where no Democrat disagrees whatsoever, is on abortion. is there any Democrat in the race who would even consider restricting abortion in the slightest?
But I wouldn't say that that's the paramount value. That's one thing they all agree with, but nobody's talking about it. It's not anywhere near the agenda of what the Democrats are talking about, whereas holding down the size of government is the center of the agenda of the Republican Party.
If something is so unanimous that it can't even be discussed, then that shows you just how powerful it is.
It's unanimity on the Republican side that the sun rises in the east. It doesn't mean that it's important to their agenda. I mean,
but if you were to make a list of right to choose, gay rights, and not restricting immigration in any serious way, I think that's the most powerful set of issues inside the Democratic primary. Much more so than worker rights.
Gosh, I don't know. I just don't know if I agree with that. I mean, I think you've seen a lot of loosening of the rhetoric and, in some sense, the policies on abortion in the last few years. You've got,
you have, and the party. That's why people like Bob Casey is now a U.S. senator for that reason.
So,
I think there's a whole set of younger Democrats, or at least junior Democrats, like Jim Webb and Brian Tester and the guy John Tester and Brian Schweitzer in Montana, who are conscious of this. But I've been struck by. A fellow who seemed like a reasonable, plausible, moderate, John Edwards, simply decided to become a lefty in pursuit of the nomination, and whereupon he found Hillary and Obama right there with him.
I guess what I'm saying is, abortion seems to me not, personally, an issue that's going to define the future of health of the country. I just don't personally see it as an issue, however we do it, that's going to help or necessarily hurt our, long-term competitiveness, our position in the world, our prosperity, our safety, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's something every Democrat may agree on, or most of them agree on. I just don't think it's a crucial issue. Whereas I think
that's what people who are pro-choice all say.
That it's not a crucial issue?
It's not a crucial issue. Look, do what you want. But have an abortion, don't have an abortion, but do what you want. Let's talk about something else. Let's talk about health care. I mean, the point is there are, for better or for worse, a pretty big chunk of the people in this country who are pro-life, who think abortion is evil, it's murder.
Yeah, but they're a minority.
And you can say you disagree with them, but the point is, you can't pretend they don't exist. And you can't say that's because no Democrat at the national level, at the presidential level, can bear to have the thought of even restricting a third trimester, late-term, partial birth abortion, doesn't mean there aren't lots of people who think it is the biggest issue out there. And I think those views are going to get reflected somewhere, obviously not in the Democratic Party.
Well, okay. I mean, I think most people don't really, most voters really don't want this to be the issue that defines the next election. Probably 80% of people don't want this to be the defining issue.
But do you think most voters, most are for the current abortion status quo?
I don't know. I think most voters are in general pro-choice, as I've seen the data, and would probably sign on to a compromise of the kind that Tom Daschle tried to float a few years ago, and that Amy Sullivan wrote about in our magazine, that said, first trimester abortions have the total seal of safety and approval of the federal government, and we can regulate them or outlaw them after that. And you'd get about 80% approval on that.
And what's the status quo now?
It's
total pro-choice?
I'm not sure it's total pro-choice. You have Roe v. Wade, which restricts late-term abortions, and
it
so,
does?
Sure.
No, it doesn't.
Roe v. Wade doesn't restrict late-term abortions?
I mean, Roe v. Wade in practice, the way it's worked out, hasn't. There's no restrictions at all.
Well, that could be.
The point is, all I'm saying is that look, if you're the victor in a debate, always sort of have, well, why are we arguing this anymore? I won. Let's just talk about something else. And the point is, all I'm saying is that the pro-choice forces have substantially won the debate, right. So they're naturally happy, and so they can't understand why anybody want to argue the point with them. And my point is that the determination of the top Democrats to reject what Amy Sullivan has written and others have written who are sort of closetly pro-life Democrat types have written.
I wouldn't say they're pro-life Democrats. They're pro-choice Democrats who recognize.
Well, there actually are pro-life Democrats, like Art Stupak and Bob Casey are pro-life. Right. Okay, so there are pro-life Democrats. Sure. Now, the decision made to sort of ignore what they say and to go with the Barbra Streisand position. Mm-hmm. is, I think, and the fact that we're having this debate and we're running long here, and I'm sure our Blogging Heads audience is trailing away, although we picked a hot issue we disagree on by accident. Finally, only proves that, again, how strong the libertarian consensus inside the Democratic Party is. At the top levels. At the grassroots, there are tons of pro-life Democrats. That's been proven over and over again. At the national level, and this is the reason why I think the Republicans still have a chance of winning the White House, is because among the voters, they're substantially more conservative, substantially more pro-life and concerned with moral issues that simply don't get any purchase here in Washington. And that's only proves my point, which is the libertarian consensus here in town is at odds with the non-libertarian majority in both the Democratic and Republican parties out there.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can quite get my head around sort of the larger kind of non-libertarian majority. I'm not sure what that means. Issue by issue, I think
they are socially conservative. They are anti-gay marriage. They are not too keen on free trade, and they don't mind the government regulating mine safety.
Right. Right. Well,
those are the priorities for people in Youngstown, Ohio.
I think you're absolutely right in the sense that if you were to sort of pitch to the average American a politics, it would be more restrictionist on immigration, although perhaps not as restrictionist as you might imagine. It would be mildly more restrictionist on abortion, and definitely more pro-regulation of big government. And you'd probably get 65% of the vote with a politics like that.
I agree, and instead, we're most likely to run against each other for the presidency, two free traders.
That's right.
So it'll be Bob Rubin and Hank Paulson will once again be calling the shots for whoever gets elected president.
Yeah.
So that we can stop there and just remark on that.
Yes.
That there's a failure, if you will, of the grassroots to translate themselves into the elites.
That's right. I think there's a lot of truth to that, and so we found our way back to consensus. I'm delighted.
Paul, congratulations again on your issue.
Thank you very much, Jim. Enjoy the rest of the summer.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.